dedicated to the memory of Antonia María de Oviedo Chantal on her 200th anniversary. Threads. The oblates had to cut little by little the threads with softness without hurting the sick part with affection. Welcome. Welcome to our second day of our formation sessions, Strength and Charism of a Woman. We thank those who have not muted their microphones. We ask you please to mute your microphones because we can hear the noises. So we prevent any interference. Thank you. As we said, welcome to this second session of our formation day about strength and charism of a woman. We began this celebration with one of the videos that won the competition that was presented at the opening of the bicentennial of the birth of Antonia María de Oviedo, and its name is Threads. The threads that we are invited to, as Antonia María used to say, to cut little by little with much affection. Yesterday, Maria Lourdes in her presentation referred to these threads and the courageous decision and the attitude of Antonia in a socioeconomic and political context that was very complex and limiting, especially for women in the 19th century. Today, on Sunday, we will continue discovering this great woman, and we will look at her literary work, the result of her talent and deep formation and learning, and also her social work in the church, the fruit of a vocation that has a last name, the oblate vocation. We will review her thoughts, her voice, and the mission of caring for life for those whose life was threatened. And this process will be as we are accompanied by Dr. Pere Fullana Puigserver, a, a man of faith and very much involved in the world of education with two strong concerns. One, for the story and the socio-religious involvement of the faithful based on their active commitment. Pere gives visibility to these issues. And his second great concern is the one about giving dignity to the religious story in the world of the general history. Pere Fullana is a historian from Majorca, and he's a professor at the University of the Islands. He has 3 degrees in religious science, in ecclesiastics history, and general history. He obtained the prize Ciudad de Palma in 1989 in research. He was the director of the great Encyclopedia of Mallorca, the chapter archives of the Cathedral of Mallorca, and the magazine Duke. He authored 23 books, and the number of articles and the press releases and specialized publication and collective works. Currently, he is a vice dean in the Faculty of Education in the University of the Balearic Islands. He's a member of the history group in education in the Balearic Islands, and he is and he's part of this educational patrimony. Since 2015, he coordinated the Historic Institute of our congregation. Currently, is working on the sixth volume of our historical library. It is an honor for us to work with you and to have you accompany us during this session. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Marisa. To me, it is a truly an pleasure and honor, great satisfaction to be here with you. And I'd like to begin by thanking especially the congregation, the general team, the Bicentennial Commission. Mirta spoke yesterday in its name, so I want to thank you all for this trust. I feel, and I want to speak in part on behalf of the Congregational Historic Institute that I am very proud to belong to, especially because part of what we're going to speak about is a result of a work we've been carrying out myself with Ana Inmaculada. So thank you so much for your words, Marisa, and thank you to all those who are here today for your presence. Without this feedback, without this contact or possibility to interact or speak, it doesn't many of the things that I'm going to say make no sense. So I hope that I can resonate with you based on the circumstances of this online. And I would especially like to begin by thanking the presentation, being grateful for the presentation yesterday from Maria Lourdes. It was splendid and enlightening. It gave me much peace, calm as we tackle today's theme. Sometimes you don't know exactly what language you are to use or the grammar you need to follow. In this sense, I think she was right on point, and she presented an extraordinary story of the social, political, religious context of the time. Having said this, my presentation is structured in two parts. The first one will be focused on the first part of Antonia's biography. Therefore, we're going to see her through her written works. And the second part will focus more on the beginning of the asylum and the religious vocation of Antonia in dialogue with other founders of her time and the women of her time. We're going to we're going to complete or complement my words with some slides that Roseli will be projecting, and she will somehow be in charge exactly of showing them. I see it clearly. I suppose you all see it perfectly. We start this first part through a with a gaze through the written work of Antonia María de Oviedo, especially, although every process is her vital itinerary during this first part. We're not going to get into the first, it's the first part to 1864. Anyhow, we can, this first part is divided into three main parts. First of all, so that you can understand where we're starting from, I'd like to very quickly read a sentence that Andrea Riccardi just wrote. He's the founder of Sant'Egidio and the professor of contemporary history in the Roman University. He wrote in his last work the following: the lack of historic culture to value the phenomena has entailed an impoverishment of the understanding of reality. It is one of the weak points of culture and the government of the church people of our times. It's very powerful. And he refers to the historicity, the presentation of historicity in the great theologians, especially Congar. And I mention a sentence of Father Chenund, which says that the evolution of history goes along with the mystery in the church, which is its bearing subject, and theology, that in thought and action is its expression. We should absolutely not uh, turn them atemporal in order to understand them. We rather must accept the relativity of history and fidelity to tradition. History situates us before some facts that make sense at a given time, and we must not expect these to always say or what we wish that they can say. What we need to do in this sense, and what the professor is inviting us to, as far as I understand, as he is involved in these themes, it's precisely this. It's to go back to this deep sense that Vatican II somehow gave to us. It marked the focus of history to understand the past, interpret the present, and create the future. In this history of salvation that begins with creation and that continues living currently, we will focus on literature as an instrument of transformation. But based on Antonia's writings, there's an experience, there's an intention and an action that we will explain at once. So we go forward. All of this, from our standpoint, we always talk about to what extent Antonia was a person who was linked to the tradition, to the past, a traditional past, or whether we're truly talking about a modern current person that contributes um, an interpretation. I understand, as far as I understand, Antonia represents modernity. She is a modern woman. She was born after the French Revolution at a time of great uh, uprisings, revolutions, and changes, but she lives fully in modernity, and we'll see this in different aspects. In fact, she's the daughter of a bourgeois. She's a person who was politically involved. She's part of a social class, the social class that remained as the ruling class in the new society, in modern society. And in her involvement, she will also suffer the inconveniences in this dialogue between tradition and the new social and political models. But at the same time, Antonia will very actively participate in great movements. On the one hand, political movements as well as educational, and on the other hand, also from the ideological standpoint, she has very direct contacts with influence, with the people of influence. She, contrary to other people, she did not live in a very local and enclosed atmosphere with no contacts with the outside or without contacts with the world. I think that we have to situate Antonia in that she sees and she knows what's going on because something very important is happening in her two major family references. On the one hand, the evolution of her mother from Protestantism to Catholicism in a nation with states that are Catholic and Protestants during an open cultural and religious war that is very much very present in Antonia's childhood. On the other hand, be, because of her paternal experience, because her father is a Spaniard who escaped, he took refuge in Switzerland, but at the same time, he is guarded, he's protected. So, in this sense, I think we have to situate Antonia among the Spaniard foundresses. She is a person with meaning, identity, and because of her origin, because of her experience, and because of the formation she received, she is very interesting and attractive from many perspectives. Therefore, Antonia's history is shows what is basic in her is history is her childhood, her relation with her mother. I loved Maria Lourdes's perspective. She was basically formed in absence of her father with a mother who was educated, exposed, living very much in touch with new times. She has certain visibility in her society, but let us not forget that Europe between 1822 and 1864 in Europe, Antonia, since she was very young, started to be a person of action on several fronts. We were talking about an agent of change yesterday, but I, I, she is at least a very active person. All her biographers agree with this. And I think that this is very important. And she's capable of doing, and at every time, and she's capable of doing a reflection about every single moment she's experiencing as she writes in her way of expressing herself, even though she was confused with a painter by the same name. She writes. She's a reflexive person. She's a quiet person who observes, reflects, and reaches conclusions. But as far as I understand, her literature at all times is also part of her life choices. So her literature has an objective. It was devised to transmit something and to be published. Her biographies always include, or she actually left with her sisters, the sisters who maintained her tradition, her memory since they were very young. She always kept very much in mind the situation of the church in general, but especially the situation of the papacy, the suffering experienced by the European church, basically because of the revolution. The French Revolution came to an end, but we will then see the liberal revolutions, and until 1848 it is not just the European revolution, but the Pope has to be exiled from Rome in 1848. And this is especially in the minds of the Catholic communities. But at the same time, let's pay attention to this one issue. In the 30th, and in Spain in 3036, traditional religious life disappears as it was understood. But Gregory the 16th, who had been elected as Pope, dying in 1846, is succeeded by Pius IX. Gregory the 16th is the last religious pope in history until the arrival of Francis in 2013. There are no religious popes for basically 167 years. The religious as an element, traditional religious life as we had understood it stops existing. And Gregory the 16th is from an order that basically has disappeared and now it's non-existent. So our world has collapsed and a new one has emerged. In this new world, Francis right now is creating this bridge. But I understand Antonia in this sense, or during this time, we see her doing great things, taking very interesting initiatives, not always sought for. But I understand that every one of the experiences that she has marks her in Fribourg, or in the case of Spain, in Paris, in Rome, and then upon her return to Madrid. Very few people have had such an intense experience as Antonia by the age of 40. When we study the history of Spain, I'm not talking about the universal history that we studied, but we know very little of international history. In 1848, during the internal war among Protestants and Catholics, the Catholic bishop of Fribourg was kidnapped. And because of this, the Spanish state was interested in covering. And there was a movement of 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 uh, uh, of there was a movement to move closer between Spain and Switzerland. Juana Martinez Metadera precisely studied this closeness in her doctoral thesis. The ambassador in Bern, but especially all the embassies, all the diplomatic seats in Switzerland enter the Catholic environments because they come from a Catholic monarchy with young Elizabeth II as a leader. But in this sense, this church is looking to Rome because it is seeing that what is happening in Europe, that is the Catholics are suffering the revolution, but also the papacy, the Pope is suffering from that. That universe, that church, the faithful believe that without a Pope, without a King Pope, the church can collapse forever. So there's a panic about losing whatever is temporal. Today, we see it as something that can be done without, but at the time, it was something basic and necessary because wars are not only political, they are cultural, they are about standpoints and ways of understanding reality. And in Europe, I would not only speak of ideological problems, but in a global perspective, everything starts being very mixed, lost in a chaos, in a search for connections and the lines among the groups. Antonia, because of her formation and because of what is happening in Switzerland, she has the opportunity of becoming very familiar with all these notions because it is a community that feels pursued, persecuted, and martyred. When she meets with Jose Maria Benito Serra, who also feels pursued by the liberals and feels frustrated in his projects as Benedictine or as religious, he sees that Europe is going adrift. So although they come from totally different experiences, they find something in common. And in addition, both of them carry in their DNA something that is essential, is that is both come from families of trade. He came from Catalonia, she came from the civilian or Andalusian world with great relations with the outside. I understand that we should not lose sight of the biographies and the generations. Every generation says what can be said based on the circumstances. We cannot ask a generation to provide something that is outside of its time. Here we are getting into the second stage. Antonia is going to go from an involvement and a commitment that was more related to a Catholic action in a society that was marked by revolution. As far as the nuances, I don't know whether Carlism or ultramontanism Puritanism are more cumbersome. What is truly affecting, what is truly important in them is they are against the revolution. They think that the evil, what is truly affecting society, are the principles of revolution and the radicalization of the revolution, because it is experienced in 1830 and 1848. Remember the Miserables by Victor Hugo, remember the literature at the time. And the impact in Antonia and in Serra, there are two very dense experiences that will merge. That is, that they experienced the revolution in the first place, and they especially focus on the future of their lives. Their view, the positive side is that their view is very international. Serra completes his term as a bishop, and he comes from a position of bishop in Australia, where he has to work for the British Empire with some rules for the bishops and Catholics that are very difficult to comply with, and with some issues that are very difficult for a Spaniard, not so much for a Spaniard religious in a large monastery, but difficult for a bishop, since you cannot have any assets, resources, and you are no longer attached to the Catholic Church except for the Holy See. Let us not forget that Serra is not a Spanish bishop, he's an Austrian bishop abiding to the rules of the Holy See and the diplomatic relations of the nunciature. He reports to London, not to Madrid. So at the time of specific conclusions, we should not lose track of this. Let us now get into the literature. As far as I understand, for Antonia, literature is not a hobby or something for entertainment. In some cases, it may be, but everything that Antonia writes, right now we have about 40 works that have been identified, many of them unpublished, but among those that were published, those that were published in some newspaper, in addition to the ones that are still unpublished in the archives, we're talking about 40 titles. And certainly, as soon as this is studied more attentively, we'll find some more. So Antonia writes that poetry is something that is a substantial. Dialogues are very much relate to her didactic and educational work, just as comedies. She did not like theater, but she writes dialogues and comedies for education to explain directly and simply. What she does appreciate are especially the historic and travel writings and the religious work. I think that that is what is essential in her work. Sorry, can you please go a little slower because in Portuguese, the translation is a little complicated. As we get into the topic of poetry, we notice a great production since she was very young. She wrote many poems. What we have preserved is just one part of what she wrote because it's usually poems of circumstance about specific moments. Many poets work with poems of circumstance, and oftentimes the manuscript is given to the person that the poem was dedicated to. And then there are other instances that are very emotional about happiness, homeland, dreams. There's always an emotional element. And I highlighted in yellow that a very small part of the works that were preserved are subsequent. Actually, one is subsequent to 1864, which allows us to conclude that we're talking about an author who stops writing poetry as of the time that she began her work of the asylum. And now, if we go from poetry to dialogues, the dialogues and the comedies is something that is generally not well known, but it is very specific to that time. Usually in the feasts, during the celebrations in educational centers, when awards were given or during musical celebrations, at the times when private educational centers during the first half of the century, this was very typical of France. And she applies this to the royal family. It's about writing small pieces, small works, so that the girls themselves could somehow interpret, always carrying a moral message about summarizing an itinerary. These are small works with messages so that the children can reflect, but at the same time, so that the audience can understand the meaning. There's another work that is listed in the inventory of the works of Antonia, that is the missionary. It basically follows the same model when around 1860, Monsignor Serra and meets in Rome, and then he leaves Rome and moves to Spain, and she writes the work, The Missionary. It is a story in a dialogue between missionaries, and supposedly Serra and Salvador are writing about their adventures since they decide to depart or to uh, offer themselves as Benedictine missionaries, more than comedies in the sense of a theater that was aimed at entertaining. I think that these are dialogues and comedies that are totally educational, conceived to tell a story addressed to an audience that is very concrete and specific. Going to the writings, the historical and travel works, Antonia, as far as we heard yesterday and as we know about Antonia's experience with the court on the one part, but especially with education and accompaniment of the daughters with the Duke of Riensabes and Maria Cristina. She travels and somehow she benefits from these travels and she actually develops her personality, her studies, curiosity, readings, and experiences that are very much updated are reflected in that. But it's especially about Antonia's capability to reflect on history, on the past, the present, and while describing, as the great writers did, there's a great tradition in church and in European society about this type of books. But especially today, that is, I think it is September 18th, 2022, certainly as we are here gathered, many people in the world are attentive to what is happening in London. As you know, something is happening. I'd like to read to you as an example what Antonia writes when she visits London in 1853 and she visits Westminster and she says that the distraction that is offered there consists in admiring the tombs, the graves. Today, somebody's being buried in the well-known pantheon of princes and great men. It is the pantheon of famous and great men. Every century, every greatness has its ovation there. Splendid monuments are an homage to science and fine arts, poetry, and paintings have their trophies. The statesman, the warrior, the craftsman whose work was useful to the homeland. All glories, whether public or private, have a page in this great book that is open to posterity to show that he did not do it himself and that the homeland rewards all those who work for it. A reward that is often non-existent on the grave. Look at who they are recalling, all those who were protagonists in history, but there are craftsmen and people with some with trades that made those great graves possible by working the stone and building those graves, but they're not listed there and they are totally anonymous. We also have the magnificent graves of the kings very close to the place where they begin their reign as they receive the crown. It seems like we want to show them that by raising to the throne, the monarch has to die to himself and live for the happiness of his people. What a contrast, what a lesson. What gives meaning to the monarch is the happiness of his people. That's where power begins, and here it is where it ends. They have disappeared forever. Blessed the one who, wha- while receiving a crown among the graves, could recall that he was to receive another one that was eternal. This is in memory of Antonia, but especially during this day, so that we understand that Antonia visits her father's grave. She visits and she especially goes to London. She sees a modern town and she's capable of understanding, of reading. She speaks of London as the great city of the present and the great city of the future. She speaks and writes about the great Universal Expo in London. She traveled to London with a royal family. But I understand that these works set the tone, set the tone of the great personality Antonia has, her identity, her capability of seeing what the eyes don't see, but that she, because of her culture, understanding of society and life, captures very naturally. Now, about the novels, time is passing very quickly. Of course, you all know and you've all read El Rosal de Magdalena. It's perhaps her best known work with the greatest number of editions. As you know, El Rosal de Magdalena came up during this boom of literary work around the Roman catacombs, especially based on the great work of Cardinal Wiseman, the work of Fabiola that was published in 1853, the year when Antonia traveled to London. Wiseman is the Catholic Archbishop of London. Therefore, Antonia is a contemporary of these great movements. Why does Wiseman write Fabiola? Because 2 years before, he there was a novel that had been written called Di Patia, and it's been transformed, and there was a movie based on this book about the philosopher persecuted by the Christians. Wiseman writes Fabiola. This character this character was a member of the early communities in Rome, and this was based on the boom of the excavations of the Roman catacombs, but especially there's an essential fact that is very important. It is a novel that explains the thinking. It is a novel that is almost autobiographic. The protagonists in part come from Switzerland and Fribourg, and it is situated in the catacombs. The characters are poor. It's a different perspective. They are from the 19th century. And through this novel, she claims Rome as the city of the popes, the martyrs, but also the current capital of the pontifical states. She constantly repeats and then mentions the Pope as the King Pope and Rome as the ideal city. Rome is threatened by revolutionaries. Anything that is a revolution deserves to be described as such, and she does not avoid describing the family that is a neighbor of the protagonist. But somehow they're intoxicated by the revolution, and especially they're ungrateful because Rome is the ideal city. Rome has the best services. Rome has the best religious acts, the best weather. Rome is somehow heaven on earth. And she wants to express that anything that is around the Pope does not deserve a negative perspective. As a member of this great European community, that she understands that we have to make public, we have to publicize the goodness of the church and the goodness it does for society, as well as all the aspects that give visibility to the goodness of religion and all the benefits that the faithful contribute to society need to be highlighted, and she wants to spread them. I think that well, she's going to suffer from this work when she was older because it became sort of a bestseller, and many editions were published, and the style at the time was to publish these novels on a daily basis on newspapers. But she had published it just as Dickens had published Oliver Twist. I have no time to read some paragraphs, but it is truly worth paying attention to this work. As we continue with the religious work, of course, they are more numerous and they share the same basis. Whether they are Marian works or Eucharistic, or if they are more ecclesiastic or missionary, as we will see later, they share the same theme. It is it is equating. That's why we began talking about Antonian history, because Antonia thinks that the church makes sense if we are based on the experience of Jesus of Nazareth, if we distance ourselves, if we are based on the experience of the apostles, but especially the experience of the suffering and martyrdom, especially the experience that is reflected and forged through Roman archaeology and especially the catacombs. But she compares that and works in parallel with the revolution. That is the revolution that somehow is highlighting the social and political life in the world or in Europe. Right now, this persecution is causing martyrdom and sacrifices. The Catholic has a sense of suffering as a victim. The Catholic, the faithful, victimizes himself. In this situation, it's not martyrdom from a physical perspective because she shares, she somehow, she's the daughter of an exiled man. Her father died dies in London because he is persecuted because of new liberalism and the revolution for being a Catholic. So she loses her father, and she's very marked by this, but at the same time, she sees how, with the freedom of press that she enjoys and in the environment where she moves, she sees that the church is constantly being martyred. It's being removed from public spaces, and it's being persecuted, with the difference that in Rome, slaves and poor Christians were persecuted, and hierarchs, because they were members of a society with no power. But now the power of the church was being persecuted. In this terminology, there's a need, and that is why she will be tied to the issue of missionaries and propaganda fide. It's about giving the means to, on the one hand, open up to these new territories that are being discovered, where we are arriving in the 19th century, because there are transportation means, because we will get to have a train and steamships, and we can travel more quickly. I think you can consider that the Canal of Suez was being opened, that there were great works being done to shorten distances around the planet, and she is very aware of this. Otherwise, it would have not been possible to summons the First Vatican Council. She is aware of the marvels occurring in the 19th century. Extraordinary things are happening, and she's not negative about it, but she doesn't understand why the Pope needs to be sacrificed so that this new world can be a happy world. She understands that she needs religion, and she needs Roman religion, because she is perceiving that the Pope is the point of union in the universal church, a universal church that displays itself as being very open. And today we see that. We know that there's been the independence of South America, that new channels have been opened, that the relationship with Asia is now routine, and the issue of all the colonies, that was the time of colonialism. But Europe is tracing many lines, and the Vatican and the Holy See has something to contribute. On the one hand, it is based on the pontifical state, with a pope who is king and a pope who has to be the point of union. But this, in September of 1870, the papacy loses its territory but gains in authority. The figure of the Pope is legitimized with the dogma of infallibility, so he is recognized as the supreme authority and reinforced as an element around which, at the center of universal church. and that will give rise to a new style of literature. And Antonia, well, I don't know many women of about whom we can speak of this connection between the Holy See and the work that is being done. She writes, she's publishing in newspapers. She is doing something that was among the objectives and at that of what at the time was called the White International. The White International was a Catholic international whose objective was precisely to defend the church and strengthen the first authority to make it become the great voice, the axis of this church that is suffering and that is dying, but ultimately the properties are dropped to the structure, the patrimony, the production, but a new production that is more theological is going to emerge, something that is simpler, more evangelizing, with an action that follows new lines, and Antonia will be there. Let's turn the pages because we're coming to the end of this part. The autobiographical works of Antonia that we know, I suppose more will be published, or the actual biographies that also show this projection and this autobiographical nature. The works are from her youth or when she speaks of her experience. But this to me is essential to get into the person of Antonia Maria, because through these reflections based on her conscience and the world she experienced, this sets the tone. It provides a reflection, an image of what her life was and how she understood it. And I think that throughout her work, and I see it in the Rosal de Magdalena, I see it in her travel books, she projects her consciousness very much, her ways of understanding reality, and that's where she appears with a very unusual identity for the time, with a very plural and multifaceted knowledge. And that's what especially makes her great. Now to a next slide that is blank because we're going to build the presence of Antonia at the time in press on new publications on newspapers uh, across the border, either because she's asked for them, but a huge inventory of works will emerge from there. As to the last point, we get into the reflection that is very quick. She lives, she experiences the last wars. We've highlighted the Carlist wars very much in Spain, but I think that we also have to highlight the last religious wars in Europe. The Protestants on the one part, Protestant and Catholics on the other, liberals and traditionalists, the integralism, the Italians, the liberals, and this war this cultural and religious war, these are at the basis, they're within the church among between liberal Catholics and anti-liberal Catholics that were sentenced in 1831. Think about Lamennais, Ilavenir, this group of Lacordaire, but all of this and many of these wars are forged through press and literature, and she's present in this when she writes that men are in the trenches and women are in prayer, and also the Carlist candidate reminds Father Serra, but it's not true. These writers are also present in this exchange between among the great axes in ideology or European power. Clearly, during this first stage, Antonia is also a person of action. She already is in the world of scholarization on the one hand, in the world of propaganda. She gets to propaganda fide, but I really don't know how she got there. I don't think she got there through her knowledge of a few people. She played a very close role to, she played a role that was very close to the first hierarchs. In this sense, there's something that's fundamental, that is that Antonia is modern in the sense that she is a person who works. Nobility did not work. The princes of the church did not work. She works. She's a professional. She's an educator. She's a governess and a writer. And she turns her writing into a job. She lives on this and she tries to ensure it is a commitment. We'll see how this is exemplified during the second part of the presentation. But here, this is at the time Father Claret, the Bishop Casave in Catalonia, are creating magazines, newspapers. They're creating libraries and ways of strengthening the religious and popular literature. For this, you have to know how to read and write. We are already with acts of cult. Of course, there's a great insistence in the world of worship, but celebration is not understood. Women start going to worship with their pious books and prayer books, and this is already present in many homes, even in popular classes in Europe. In Spain, there's a great market of this type of literature, and there are great networks of authors. And Antonia, in my view, is one of the most evident and the few, one of the few that I would pay attention to and know how to define at this time. When we speak of action, when we have religious life in our mind, if we have to label religious life during the first half of the 19th century, we still consider the Daughters of Charity. There are some French congregations that are coming to Spain some congregations coming from the outside, but in Spain, there's no institution of educated women with a culture, and I say this intentionally. Antonia also has this point. She's French by culture, but this situates us in these labels that we still have of religious life, still uh, bars. It's about the world of childhood, the cloistered world, the world of consecrated people who are still in the semi-religiosity. And to conclude, I understand I understand that we should keep in mind that in the Europe experienced by Antonia, she especially shares the suffering of revolution. She shares homes and experiences with exiled people. The Marquis are Spanish exiled people who are outside of the country with their family needing to educate their children. Maria Cristina will be exiled at the Malmaison in Paris. She moves around a pope who had to be exiled to Gaeta. Jose Maria Benito Serra is exclaustrated as he tries to return to the situation, and he is committed to restoring a religious order. In the face of all of this, I think that we are exposed to many fronts, and we should take advantage of this bicentennial to also place Antonia on the map, to place her in history books. She's already there. She is present and she has a written culture that is not a culture for self-satisfaction. It is an activist culture as an answer to this experience. And at the same time, she has a project. She's thinking about a society model, a model for the future. She does not imagine that she will be an important player in this ideal scenario that she's imagining as a future, what is about to happen and what would represent the future of the church as of 1860. And now that we are working on the biography of the mother written by Sister Vicenta, she highlights this character of Antonia as a person who's very committed to the project of the church. And she forges this very concretely, this referring to her closeness to the Pope Pius IX. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's the passage through the literary work of Antonia has been very interesting. And as you've said, she turns writing and literature into a commitment. I hope that this also applies to the people who were listening. and that this is generating some dialogue for questions. So now we open up a space so that through the chat or the microphone, as you raise your hand, you may ask questions that Priscilla will then submit to. Thank you so much. As we formulate the questions, since I have the microphone, I'm going to begin with one that came to me while you were presenting. You said that literature is is a tool for transformation, a very interesting expression. Although you've mentioned it quickly at the end, but my question is, how did Antonia precisely influence this transformation with her literary work in the church context that she lived in? We saw this yesterday, and I think that Professor Lourdes expressed this very clearly. It is a society that is still very much based on elite. We have to think that we have to think about newspapers, magazines. There's the bourgeoisie and the lower bourgeoisie are consume pious books, but the newspapers, we see them today. I mean, the newspapers of the time were pages and pages in small font, and you'd had to know how to read. But who read newspapers? The elites. To be on a newspaper, to be on the cover page of a newspaper means that you are reaching the environments of power, be that in the church or in the civil society. The fact that she's among the chosen ones enjoying this presence, I think that they are aware that what they write is actually going to influence. And she is knowledgeable. She shares her day to day with the people with first-hand experience. They're not distanced. And the time that she lives, that she spends with the family of Maria Cristina, the biographies of Maria Cristina indicate increasingly what the life of Maria Cristina was going to be. It was a workshop of modernity, of great inventions. Maria Cristina in her life was the one who supported the Mendizabal, and she had Donoso Cortés in her firm. He was among the main writers who led this international white. In her palace, there's a dialogue among all of these. It's a small world, and I think this suggests that you have a direct connection with this reality. If around you see people on the front line, she writes and she's asked to write. I think this is done because what she was doing really carried weight. So, what is her influence? Well, we don't have any hints and evidence today of of the degree of influence of these newspapers, but they're there, and she was known. That is for sure. Thank you so much. Okay, we have three questions in the chat. I will ask the three of them. Antonia was a an educated person. She was a professional in education and concerned about her faith. And she combined the action and literary production. What is her what is your perception? What production of what amount of production of contents did she write? Then can can we include as a genre the part of the letters that were drafted by Antonia, the aspect as a writer of Antonia together with her vital experience in the Exo? How does this affect her when she started designing the project of Cien Suelos? What enlightenment can this offer to the oblates today? Well, as far as the volume of publications, well, what I can say is that as religious congregation, you are at a very high level of publications. You have biographies, partial biographies, monographies, studies, everything based on the sources and the legacy of Antonia. I've always defended, and I've said this on many occasions, I am fascinated, and I was always fascinated by the richness of the legacy preserved by the congregation when it comes to manuscripts and writings of Antonia and Serra. And especially since the 50s, and especially since the Second Vatican Council, this has allowed a renewal, a second refounding of the congregation, because we've gone back to the sources, and everything that could have happened during the boom of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s turned to the spirit of Antonia and the congregational spirit, and that was asked for by the decrees in Vatican II. And the educational model of Antonia that we'll look at later, I think still is still stated with the language is still valid, although with the grammar and the terminology of that century. The professor yesterday highlighted this directly and indirectly, but of course, education in Europe, our main sources are in Switzerland. Rousseau, to begin with, I mean, the conference yesterday started by mentioning Rousseau. Pestalozzi, Rousseau, Froebel were all in the same environment, and that was at the time of Antonia, and that's when the great thoughts emerged in France and Switzerland, and this is going to influence in the rest of the world, and it's still one of the great themes of today. The third question you asked me, as far as the writing of Antonia together with her vital experience of exile, how does that uh, how does that influence her when she is putting together the project of Cienpozuelos, and what lights does it give to us oblates today? I've seen, I as a historian, what I see is that her baggage, what she reflected on, what she read and experienced, is what makes her change her life in an unimaginable way, because she sees she imagines the world differently, but as she's doing it, she is convinced that she feels truly called. She needs to do in order to understand what she needs to do. But she has the capability, and she especially has something that others don't have. Vicenta Lopez, the other foundress, will have this. That is, they are prepared, they're formed to educate in a world that is truly difficult. We're not talking about scholarizing. We're not talking about teaching how to read. We're talking about re-educating, reintegrating, and offering a future to some people. The teacher is in charge of you learning some things, but whatever happens afterwards is not his problem. But Antonia knows that the formation that she is providing is only a transcendental moment in the life of the people. Without the previous experience, without the dramas that she has experienced as a governess, I would say as a pedagogue, something that has been seen in history as something negative is that she was like passing through many places, and the fact that she was passing through made her experience very different and deep things. And when she settles in a place like Tiempos Suelos, and when she truly becomes a completely different person forever, this experience, what she experienced as she was passing through, is going to generate something around her, and she will become a reference, the reference of an impressive strength, not only within the home, but also among the people who know her. Two more questions. There are many women foundresses in the 19th century that bet on the reform of the church and committed to that. How can you, how do you judge the fact that almost all of them express themselves in their writings in a style that is like beyond borders? Is it just a pious issue? No, on the contrary, the the liberal Catholics that were more progressive and bourgeois and more modern in an ideological sense thought that this was a state obligation, that is education, wisdom, and charity. They imagined that this was a duty of the liberal state. In uh, in the sectors that were beyond borders, they imagined that states could actually establish the institution, but they had no soul. The more religious ones, the more traditional ones, from spiritual perspective, do realize that there's something that is the spirit, the soul, and the Christian spirit, the Christian morality. You can create a center for girls coming out of the hospital, girls wounded by life, but without this fact, without this moral and spiritual reality, these girls will just return to their situations. They will have a bureaucratic solution and a good service, but humanly, I think that beyond these women, there are two faces. On the one hand, one side with a very traditional religious language, but on the other hand, they participate to the language and the Catholic humanity of the 16th and 17th century. That is, no poor person has to be left outside. First of all, we have to classify the poor, and these women maintain records and they know how to discern who who is poor. They don't work in a casual manner. They just do not work in assistance for the sake of it. Everything is very classified. They are in a very modern culture when it comes from the perspective of projects. Vicenta and Antonia and the adorers work with a very modern methodology, but they do something that public institutions and the more revolutionary ones do not do, which is they work with the person, except for the more radical members of popular sectors. The working classes also try to regenerate people, and they have a special passion for the regeneration of the person from an atheist standpoint, but they do advocate for an anthropological morality, a morality of universal rights, and with this secularized language, they they work with a common language based on ethics of rights and justice, thinking that the world is orderly and it is controlled by a great architect. So there is a philanthropy, and these philanthropers give, organize, do with a system that is parallel to the Catholic sectors. And as you see in current Europe, there's great secularization, but now there's great respect for the social works that the churches, be that Anglican, Protestants, or Catholics, carry out and promote. In that, in the 19th century, it was more difficult, and especially the liberal literature is responsible for labeling as uh, being more radical than what they actually were. Just one resonance from Carmen in the chat box. We thank you for everything you've been presenting. Many fronts that have not been explored are opening up. A task and a commitment. It'd be great to prepare a biography of Antonia and Serra, just as the psychological profile of both. I agree. In addition, I think that every generation, especially ours or yours, those who follow, I think that, just as Get used to say, every generation should reread the sources and history and has to look at those points and those bridges, because sometimes, as Pope John 23rd used to say when he was a historian, oftentimes we stay on the level of the anecdote and we don't go to the essence. The essence of history is very simple. The essence of Antonia is very powerful, but obviously we have to extract the contents with the tools that we have today, with the visions we have today, and especially with the great questions that we ask ourselves. Javier Marias, who just passed away, wrote in one of his last writings that we should not fear to face reality as it is. We should not fear, that is, let us analyze the things, and we're not going to see a perfect woman. We'll see the woman that she was, but we have to know the woman that she was deeply, because certainly she gave a lot of herself, and there are great connections between the essence of Antonia and the essence of what is being projected currently, of course, with different modalities and different languages. So thanks again for this beautiful presentation, for the interesting questions and comments. We're now going to take a break for 15 minutes, and we meet again after this time. Thank you so much. There's a fascinating origin of the pearls that are formed with a substance that transforms everything into a pearl. And so Antonia was born. Antonia produced many pearls with great exchanges and challenges. She lives through the most important stage of her vocation. She had much of a teacher and mother, teaching, but also especially educating for life. She breaks away early from her path, but she opens up to the mystery, the providence of the good God. Another pearl at the age of 16, the rule of life. In the face of the hardness of life, she takes up this moment to she elaborates Mother of Pearl in prayer and Eucharist. She's always producing Mother of Pearl to understand her itinerary of generosity. Her opening to beauty is her characteristic. From there, you can understand her pedagogy. She discovered, like no one, the beauty hidden in the face of the marginalized woman who exercised her profession in a sad corner of town. She lived what she believed in, and she announced what she lived. Today, the Oblate family still covers with Mother of Pearl all the cries and hopes to transform this reality where social injustice is still present but doesn't have the last word.